and then we're going to go live. Have a great event.
Thank you.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Carol Edgarian presenting her new book, Vera. She'll be talking with Jennifer Egan, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Carol, Jennifer, and the team at Scribner for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. But if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting them there and not in the chat. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Vera, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Carol's book and many others on site. Or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in just a moment. And we do have a limited number of book plates signed by Carol. If you want one of those, please email us at events, EVENTS, at greenlightbookstore.com, and we can mail it to you. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for tonight is Jennifer Egan. She is the award-winning New York Times bestselling author of 6 novels, including A Visit from the Goon Squad, which won the Pulitzer Prize, among other honors, and most recently, Manhattan Beach, which was selected as the One Book, One New York title in 2018. Egan is not only our neighbor, but a wonderful friend and supporter of the store who has graced the Greenlight stage many times before, and we are always thrilled to have her back. She'll be speaking with our featured author, Carol Edgarian. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, 3 Stages of Amazement, and the international bestseller, Rise to Euphrates, winner of the ANC Freedom Prize. Her articles and essays have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and W, among many others. She is co-founder of the nonprofit Narrative, a leading digital publisher of fiction, poetry, and art, and Narrative in the Schools, which provides reading and writing resources to teachers and students around the world. Edgarian lives with her family in San Francisco. Her new book, Vera, is a cinematic and deeply enthralling adventure set in 1906 San Francisco, a city leveled by quake and fire, greed, and corruption. It's received praise from a number of celebrated writers, including Mary Beth Keane, Andre Dubus III, Anne Beattie, and Anna Solomon, who says, Vera is a triumph, a story of disaster and healing, power and humility, grit and grace, set against the lush, lascivious backdrop of San Francisco during the 1906 earthquake. This book is as whip-smart as its heroine and as electric as her city and will haunt me in the best way for a long time to come. Carol is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Jennifer and with all of you. Please take it away, Carol.
Thank you. What a wonderful introduction. And thank you, Jenny. And thank you for everybody for being here. I'm going to read actually the first page, and it's called First Things. I always thought of my city as a woman, but the house, it turned out, was a woman too. When the quake hit, she groaned. Her timbers strained to hold on to their pins, the pins snapping, and the rocks beneath the house, they had voices too. And if ever I wondered how long it would take for the world to end, I know. 45 seconds. An unearthly stillness preceded and followed the shaking. It's what we did and didn't do in the stillness that determined the rest of our days. I lost 2 mothers that year. The first was Rose. I can't say where she was born or where her kin came from. The fact is, I don't know what mix of blood flows through me. I suspect there's some Persian, possibly Armenian. I understand there may be some Northern African and Spanish in the mix too, and a good pour of French. Spanish by way of Mexico. None of this Rose would confirm or deny. We're mutts, she said, and left it at that. One of the harlots claimed that Rose had been found as a waif in the slums of Mexico City. For a fee, she was brought north. I believe that. I believe most anything when it comes to Rose. She spoke 5 languages, her hair was blue-black, her skin copper, her eyes green. In San Francisco, she became a much favored prostitute, catering to the gold rush miners. Her next clients were the fellows who came after the miners, the suit-wearing bankers and merchants who thought they could gentle a murderous, gambling, whoring town. They thought they could gentle Rose. Instead, she became the grande dame of the Barbary Coast, the Rose of the Rose. She did not raise me. That duty fell to a Swedish widow employed to bring me up to be, I suppose, anything but a hooker. In that, Maury Johnson was successful. I am not a hooker. I am only a thief.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's wonderful to be with all of you, and it's very fun to be having a talk with my old and dear friend, Carol.
I love you.
It's good to see you, and thank you everyone for joining us. So Carol, your appropriately titled novel, Vera, really is to some degree a kind of testament to a forceful and singular personality and voice, that of your protagonist, Vera. And you describe a little bit about her in that preamble, but I wonder if you could give us a sense. This is a book in which normal life is upended by a disaster, something that I think we probably can all relate to pretty well right now. Give us a sense of what ordinary life looked like for Vera before the earthquake hit, because the novel goes on for a bit before that happens, and we get a sense of San Francisco at that moment.
Well, she's 15, and she has been raised in a most unconventional way. In 1906, she is the daughter, as we've just learned, of Rose, who is one of the most successful madams in town. But Rose is not raising her. Rose has decided to put her with a family for hire, essentially. And she has chosen a widow, Maury Johnson, who has one child, a daughter, Pi. And Maury has her own problems. She's a tippler. She's a bit of a gambler. So where the book begins, we find Vera in this moment of in her home life. She's in crisis because of Maury's problems, and more to the point, she's an outsider in her own home. Her foster mother is very conventional, as is her sister, and she's neither conventional nor ladylike in the strictures of 1906. She's smart, she's contrary, she's somewhat restless, and in that way an outsider, and not just an outsider, but a girl who's yearning for some kind of place of belonging and for love.
I have to just read a couple of sentences from the very beginning of the book that I think captures Vera so perfectly. I walked fast, talked fast, scowled. I carried the stick of my parasol hard on my shoulder with all the delicacy of a miner carting a shovel. The morning sun blasted my cheeks, and anyone fool enough to come up behind me risked getting his eye poked. I think that kind of says it all. So that's Vera. So again, to life before the earthquake, the social order of San Francisco that you portray is kind of fascinating. It feels like the demi-monde of the city is very intertwined with polite society. It feels almost as if there's no barrier between them. And I'm just curious if you can kind of give us a sense of the sort of social environment of San Francisco in that moment.
Well, the thing to remember about this city for for good and ill, is it was founded by miners. So it was founded by these not particularly elegant or educated, very much entrepreneurial folk who were out to get rich, who were risk takers, who when they struck gold had a lot of money to spend. And so what did they spend it on? The service industries that sprung up around the miners. Very, very quickly, prostitution was a leading business in town. And in fact, the madams were revered. The madams were serious business people by the time. So fast forward to 1906, San Francisco still had that renegade quality, had that rules don't apply to us, a kind of crazy optimism, and of course on the shadow side, hubris. And in the moment of 1906, when the quake hit, I mean, there was a police force was kind of an afterthought. A lot of the quote societal strictures were really sort of late in coming, but there was society forming, and very much so because the business was booming at the time. But San Francisco was still not, it hadn't quite arrived. And one of the early scenes, without talking too much about giving away the plot of the book, is Caruso came to town, and on Caruso, Enrico Caruso was very nervous coming to San Francisco because he had read about this murderous town, and it still was very much thought of that way. And on the train ride out from New York to San Francisco, he couldn't sleep because he was convinced he was going to get killed. And he was a little unsettled anyway because Mount Vesuvius had just erupted a couple weeks before back home in Naples, outside of Naples. Anyway, so in my research, I came across a little bit that told me that he was so nervous that he had his valet get off the train and buy a pistol. That he thought he might need some protection. And he performed the night before the quake to rapturous applause. And then, of course, woke just after 5 in the morning in the dark to the quake. So his premonition was not too far off. I mean, he didn't die, he survived, but certainly something was moving toward him.
Something that his gun could not help him with.
I had to use that gun. That gun was too good to pass up.
So that brings me to actually what I want to hear about next. One of the thrills for me as a San Franciscan was really experiencing in very dramatic terms what this quake felt like to a person in the city. It's just not something I had ever really had a sense of. And I feel like your book did give me that sense. Can you take us through what actually happened? The quake itself, which I gather was not very long. But then that was not the end of it. What happened to the physical plan of San Francisco in the earthquake and after?
Well, quakes come in swarms, particularly this level of quakes. So there was the first shaker, followed quickly by another. And in fact, many, many, many aftershocks, hundreds of aftershocks across the next days. But in those early shakers, the gas lines burst, and more to the point, the water mains burst. So fires quickly erupted. So if your house didn't immediately crash down, if, say, it survived, or it might have jumped off its foundation, or parts of your house survived, you were out on the street. Now picture it's just after 5 in the morning in April, so it's still dark. In thinking and conjuring the quake, there's the shaking, there's the way, but you can't really see. And of course, there's broken glass everywhere. There's parts of your house. People are getting out on the street just as dawn is coming up. And as folks are gathering themselves, and if they can, going back in to get belongings, just over the crest of the hill, the first smoke. And ultimately, there are fires, more than 50 fires, burned 500 city blocks, 28,000 buildings, leaving more than 250,000 people homeless. So it was the quake, and then it was 3 days of fire. And that the fire, it really reduced the whole city to ashes, or most of the city to ashes. All the financial district, Chinatown. There's a story, and something that I'm always looking for in giving the complexity and giving character, because of course people are just, we make mistakes, and that is so much what we're looking for in fiction, of where, despite good intentions, things go off the rails. And there was a woman in Hayes Valley whose house had really suffered a lot, because Hayes Valley's on the flats. If you were on the flats, you were really screwed. Better to be on bedrock on the hills, as you know, as any San Franciscan knows. Her chimney had broken in half, and she had young kids, and I'm sure she was shell-shocked, from it all. And so she decided to cook them breakfast, not knowing where the next meal was coming from. And her chimney exploded, and that was what was known as the ham and eggs fire, that burned all of Hayes Valley, and a huge part of town. Was just a mother cooking breakfast.
Wow. So San Francisco is a city of hills. This is interesting. So being on a hill was definitely better than being down below. So I don't think it's giving too much away, I hope, to say that Vera ends up in a particular house, which has an enormous, which plays a big part in this story. And so can you, and she, as happens in the face of disasters or other events that upend normal life, we sometimes find ourselves, in the company of people we don't expect, doing things we don't expect, like being on Zoom instead of sitting in the bookstore together. Can you give us a sense of the crowd that Vera ends up with, into which she is swept as a result of this natural disaster?
Well, so picture everyone, most everyone is either a refugee or clinging to their unheated, unlit, broken houses. And in Vera and her sister Pi's case, they can't stay in their home, and they have to move to the one place they're not allowed to go, which in fiction is always where you want everyone to go, where they're not supposed to go. So they end up on the hill, and they end up in Rose's house, and willy-nilly other people show up, people who have been in Rose's employment. And what's interesting to me I'm always looking when I'm sort of trying to place story, I'm always looking for sort of these moments that, forgive me, have some kind of seismic change, or some kind of moment where the jig is up and what had been is impossible. And you have to, characters have to either reinvent themselves or not. I mean, everybody's given a choice. And in a catastrophe, I mean, there is a line in the book that catastrophe for many is an opportunity for some. And it falls upon Vera, not just to survive, but she collects around her a group of people who might have been pre-quake marginalized, suddenly what matters is not where one stands in society, because society has been leveled, and until it can reassert itself, until it can put its screws on people, there is that moment when the matrons of Pacific Heights are standing next to refugees who don't even have a pot or a cup. And really what happens post-quake is Vera not only takes responsibility for a band of people, but she finds her real people. And that's really the quest of the book is who shows up, you know, who and what rises in a catastrophe. And I think that's so much of what we're walking through right now.
And some of the people who show up and whom she ends up really sort of banding together are people from whom she had sort of structural separations, let's say. There are various ethnic groups, there are moral divisions that separate her even from her mother Rose, whom we should say it's a secret that Rose is her mother. This is not something that most people know, because it would be yes, it's a more freewheeling moment in San Francisco, but it's not freewheeling enough that it's okay to be the illegitimate daughter or prostitute. Talk a little bit more about some of these other worlds in San Francisco, ethnically and socially, that collide after the quake.
Well, one character who in drafting and in really thinking about this idea of not just a city that's leveled, but the boxes society puts people in get crushed, at least for a moment. One character who really begins the novel as a rival for Vera, Tan, is he is Rose's major domo. He is an accomplished chef. He is her butler. He has worked both in the brothel, and he really runs her house. And once a week, it is his duty, a duty he greatly resents, to go down to the other house where Vera lives and sort of get their act together. And this is a bother to him. This is beneath him. And the thing about Tan is that he is this elegant person who is also a Chinese person in 1906, a Chinese servant. And despite all that he knows, all his elegance and training, he is forced to live in a basement of this grand house on a dirt floor on cast off furniture, and he is really penniless. And what happens to Tan and Vera in the course of the novel, how they go from being hating each other to rivals to actually joining forces as partners, and in fact prove to each other that they're the ones they can count on, is sort of, it's that evolution of the book where it's not so much who you are, but what you are.
And I guess maybe this would be a good moment to get into what I'm sure a lot of people are very curious about, which is how one goes about reconstructing a time that that does not exist in living memory. You know, how there, you have a wonderful acknowledgments section that gives us a sense of your research. And I know that you began with sort of a collection of books, which I love the thought of, that you would just sort of interact with over years. But talk a little bit about what kinds of research brought this era to life for you and the quake itself.
So I, this is my adopted home here in San Francisco, and you can't be a resident of San Francisco and not be thinking about earthquakes, or if you're if you tend to think toward the dramatic moment, you're thinking about earthquakes. But I also started collecting, decades ago, stuff about the quake. I was fascinated with the quake, this idea that in less than a minute, an entire city can be wiped out. Read them, put them on a shelf, didn't think particularly they were going to show up in a novel. They were just sort of something turning in my head. And then when I started thinking about the book and decided I wanted to write this adventure story featuring a young woman who is outside of society, I started thinking about the quake. And this was this was really leading up to the 2016 election and thinking about what was going on in our society at the time and the precariousness and the feeling that we are in a moment of we are in a really delicate, precarious moment. And that feeling of things being so much on the edge and so much that that so much that was underneath just the surface was rising up. And it seemed like that kind of nexus had a kind of correlation with 1906, because one of course, one of the things that happens in the book that's very much of the moment in 1906 was the mayor was about to be indicted for graft the morning of the quake. And the level of corruption systemically, there was a guy, Abe Roof, who owned the sheriff and the board of supervisors and the mayor Eugene Schmitz, who was a violinist, and was put in the mayoral seat because he was, let's just say, not opposed to being on the take. So all that was going on, and that is a year of that passes in the novel. So what I did in terms of research was I just went deep. And I think you're the same way. I mean, part of why we do what we do is we get to learn about things that we're curious about and learn enough to be dangerous. So, you know, I read everything. There are incredible firsthand accounts of the quake and the survivors of the quake. Caruso had an account. And I get just sort of saturated, and then I willfully try to forget, try to just wipe the slate clean. But there are things I see in little newspaper clips, or, you know, I can never predict what's going to start moving in story in my head. And so you just don't want the book to read like research. You want it to read and to have the specificity so your reader feels absolutely in the moment, in 1906. But moving through by character, by desire, by all that complication of the foolish things people do over and over and over again.
And so did you, so you read, I guess, oral history, firsthand testimonies. You also involve a number of real people in your story, like that mayor. How did you go about that?
Well, I think one of the fun things we get to do in fiction is we get to fly on magic carpets. We get to visit with people we wouldn't normally get to brush up against. And as a writer, that's always sort of an interesting challenge. Can you make it real enough so that it's believable that your character is brushing up against all these people? And then, of course, on the human level, what happens when Vera meets Schmitz, and how is that an essential part of the story? I just thought, you know, as we learned in that first page, this is a story in which everyone is a thief. And I thought that notion of honor among thieves was really, really fun to explore. So even our Vera is a thief, ultimately.
And I guess this is, in a way, getting into questions about process, which is always so interesting because everyone does it so differently. You had this long period of kind of wondering, and then you got more serious. Once you started writing, did you already know who the major players in the story were, or did they kind of come along as you went? And where did plot come in? What is the order of events in your creative process?
I love that. the mayhem of the creative process. You know, I always start with an outline. I always start with a notion, and rework and rework and rework. But I'm always surprised. I don't know if this is true for you, but there are characters I think are going to be absolutely essential all through. And they kind of do their work and you realize you don't really need them anymore. Or some characters come forward in a way, in such a compelling way, that they cannot be denied. And I really love those surprises. I love where you start out with a plan and you have to veer, because the story is demanding that you do. Speaking about Tan, I started out with a notion about Tan, and he defied all my notions and just sort of kept showing up in new ways. And I knew I needed to follow him.
He's a great character. I can see why that happened. And you are meanwhile in San Francisco.
Yeah.
One thing that was so fun reading the book as someone who grew up in San Francisco was, recognizing places.
Yeah.
How much of pre-earthquake San Francisco still exists? And was that kind of physical, were the physical underpinnings of the city you live in important as you worked? Did your relationship to this city as a kind of physical place, how much did that play into your creative work on this?
I love the city. I love the city, even though I worry for the city. I think San Francisco right now is in a moment of crisis, in a moment of a moment of reinvention, or necessary reinvention. And as in the beginning, it is a story of haves and have-nots, of misguided hubris, but also that booming entrepreneurial optimism that makes it so ultimately so winning. I love the peaks and the valleys. It's just an inherently dramatic place, with microclimates and all the aspects of it that are just so winning and so beautiful. It's also it's a city that's burned down 5 times. So you can see where, as the fire was coming eastward, they had to create a fire break, and they chose the widest avenue, Van Ness Avenue, to make the break. And Van Ness Avenue really well.
Absolutely.
And for about 6 city blocks on Van Ness were some of the grandest mansions in town. And these mansions survived the quake. But oh no, the army had come in, and to create fire breaks, knock, knock, knock on your door, and you were told you had 45 minutes to get out, and they blew your house to smithereens. So in terms of what we can see today, the Victorians start a block from Van Ness, because in fact Van Ness became the fire break, and so everything burned up until that point, and then those houses are still standing. And it's amazing to walk around. I mean, if you walk south or east from Van Ness, you're on what had been ashes.
It's amazing too, because Van Ness is a pretty unprepossessing avenue architecturally.
Yeah.
And I feel like I never understood that until I read your book. I suddenly got it. It was just all demolished.
Yeah.
How do you think the quake and the mayhem that followed changed San Francisco? Do you have a sense of that from your research? Or did it?
You mean were lessons learned?
Well, I just mean the city had to build itself back. It was a certain kind of place before. Was it that same place after? Or do we not know?
Well, there was something that I mean, there were so many books I felt I could write looking at the research, but one of the first, the fire really swept up Nob Hill, and Chinatown quickly was in flames and gone. And there was a movement among some people to relocate Chinatown, because it was prime real estate, to put it off in Bayview, way off. And how different the city, what a huge loss that would be. And it was politically a very volatile thing to do, because huge money could have been made from people, that land grab. And in fact, Shanghai asserted itself and said, don't you dare. And it was one of those moments where a correction was made, and thank goodness it was. What a thing. But in catastrophe, in moments, and we're seeing it now. I mean, all kinds of things that have been simmering rise up, and both incredible human ingenuity and kindness, and the opposite.
One of the things that I liked very much, and I thought was very unexpected, was the relationship between Vera and her mother Rose. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. I began the book thinking, of course, this is going to be a story about a mother-daughter reconciliation, a mother-daughter discovery. There are enormous differences between the two, but there are also a lot of similarities. One of the differences that really struck me was that Rose can't read. She's illiterate, and she is I love, there's a moment where we learn that Vera excites Rose by saying what she considers to be exotic words, and I think spelling them maybe, or at least uttering them. Anyway, I would love it if you could talk about that relationship and your work with that relationship as the writer, and how it evolved.
To be there's so many sides to Rose. I mean, what the little bit I read about her, I mean, she began as a teenage prostitute, or at least that's what Vera suspects. She's not really certain where Rose comes from. Rose is very much unwilling to ever talk about her past, or really talk about anything concrete in that way. So here she is pregnant, has this child. One could imagine she is actually trying to be honorable and have Vera have a chance in society, and sets her up and pays all the bills, and in that way is proper. The one thing she denies her is any kind of affection or belonging. And of course, that's the one thing Vera yearns for. Early in the book, there's a line in which Vera is moment to moment thinking. Vera is a much older narrator of the book, but the character Vera is thinking, and she says, I had always been looking for one single adult who can show me how to behave. And of course, she never finds that adult. She has to become her. But in the course of the novel, not to give too much away, the roles reverse, and Vera very much becomes the mother figure caretaker, and Rose is really needs caretaking. And in that shift, there is the potential, and maybe we're all hoping for that moment when, they're going to come together, they're going to see each other. But I think the most fulfilling characters, and if I'm successful, it will feel that way, are contradictory. They're complex. They don't do the expected thing. They often do the opposite of the expected thing. And certainly the dance between Rose and Vera, what was interesting to me was that whole idea of nature versus nurture. How can you be somebody's child, and though you've interacted with them like only a couple times a year, and under weird circumstances, bit by bit, can you both show each other that you actually have a lot in common, because there's that DNA that's undeniable? And if so, where are you then different? Where is life, the story of your individual life come to play in the choices you make? That's kind of in the mother-daughter story. I mean, unsolvable.
I mean, to me, the thing that was very brave about the way that you follow this through is that in the end, I was really left with the feeling, blood only counts for so much. You can be of someone, and you can even be like someone, but that doesn't mean that the two of you love each other. And it kind of raises the question of, what creates that strong, that love bond in a family. And I think so much of it is shared experience, and that's the thing that they don't have because of the arrangement that Rose set up. She didn't raise Vera, and so they don't have that kind of deep um, midden of memories and points of reference and commonalities and shared history that we end up having usually with our nuclear family members.
Well, they also don't have shared values, ultimately. Ultimately, their values differ.
How would you characterize that?
Well, I want to be careful not to like give away the book, but I would say Rose has always one foot out the door, and Vera's trying to get inside. Vera's trying to get home, and Rose is trying to just not be caught in any way. And so that ultimately that is absolutely oppositional, and a bit heartbreaking, but that's okay too. I think one of the challenges I set for myself is how much can I show these characters, both in what they want and in the vulnerability that wanting brings, and the wrong rightness in there. They what I love is when characters, if they're fully dimensional, they can absolutely proclaim that they are after this one thing, and then they get in the moment and they absolutely go in the opposite direction. And I think that's a moment when they suddenly become real to readers, or it seems to me as a reader, when I find that moment that is just human, where we just miss. So that when we do come together, it feels earned. It feels like a reward.
Yeah, my stepfather used to have an expression, "Look at where your feet are," which sounds very. I found myself invoking it. He passed away long ago, but it really serves. We say we want certain things, and we think we want certain things, but often our feet are actually taking steps in a very different direction.
Right.
So I'm going to ask another question, and then I'm going to pause and we'll take some questions from outside, although I also have more. I'm curious about how this book has changed you, both in your relationship to the city and as a writer and a human. What has the experience left you with so far? I'm in the mix of it going out in the world. I would say, or even just the city, your relationship to the city itself, as you still inhabit it, you've had a whole experience with this city now that's an imaginative one that you hadn't had before.
I feel very close to the city because there's so many landmarks. There's so much of the city that that I learned about on a whole other level in my research, and to know how many times it has fallen and risen again. There's something about that. There's something about that human impulse to rebuild, to rise again, that is so I don't know, really attracts me about this place. I don't know about you, but I don't write what I know. I write toward what I want to know. I can barely see, barely reach. And if I keep going you're nodding. So I think it's the same for you. I mean, bit by bit, I'll get there. So there were things in this book that I didn't know. I didn't know how to do. And I didn't know quite what the turns would be. And in that, I learned things about life. Characters at a certain point become in some ways more real to me than some of the people in my life. I mean, they become very real, and I worry about them. I fuss about them. I take a lot of joy when they get what they want.
All right, so now is the moment where I want to look at the chat, and it also is the moment to disclose an unfortunate fact, which is that my cursor has frozen.
Oh my God.
And I've already figured out a solution to this.
Okay.
I think but I can't even use the cursor to exit from the Zoom. So I think what we should do is you should start looking at the questions and answering, and I'm going to try to get out and come back in so that I can then start looking again at the chat and orchestrating the questioning. Does that seem okay, Carol?
Yeah, but I'm not sure I see any questions. Do we have questions?
Katie, can you help us? I'm really sorry. I've been trying.
It looks like the questions, there are not any questions that have populated yet. So this is the time for the audience to, don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A module, not in the chat. So do that now so we can do the Q&A portion.
So I think what we're going to do, because I feel, since I can't even use my cursor to exit from Zoom and come back, I'm going to have to shut down the computer. I feel like maybe what we should do is Carol and I will keep talking, and then Katie, can you interject when you, if and when you see questions? Will that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So as questions come up, I will let you know, and I can ask the questions for you. Oh, it looks like we actually already have one.
Okay.
Yeah. We just got
Debbie, I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry. I don't know what the hell is wrong. Okay, I see 2 questions down there. I just can't see what they are.
Okay, let me look.
So
Carol mentioned some things were hard, some things she did not know how to do. What was an example or two?
That was my next question.
Really? I love the book. Oh, that's lovely. Hello, Lindsay. I had to figure out structurally. I had to figure out where to put the quake. That was something that I felt you needed to know the world as it existed and all the elements at play before the quake changed everything, right? So that was a dance I had to do. And in the process of that, I had to figure out Vera's evolution, Vera the character's evolution of how much she grows, how her voice changes from pre-quake to post-quake, and how to modulate that with all the players who are on stage. There are a lot of people in this book, and sort of bringing some people forward and letting others recede, and just working that modulation so the reader wasn't confused. I mean, sometimes haven't you read those books where there are so many people and you don't know who the hell is you need to care about? So that was a lot of the work in the later revisions. Hi, Natasha. What advice would you give to a first-time novelist who wants to create a world as rich as the one you've created in Vera? I think I would say be patient. Be patient, and know that if you're creating a world from research, the research is going to be more prevalent than ultimately you want it to be. I think Jenny's nodding, that you don't want the research to take over. It's all about the people. It's all about the relationships. It's about what that forward thrust is in what people are doing, and revision. That's where really books get made. Can Carol describe her working relationship with her editor? How vital was it? At a certain point in the writing, you absolutely need your readers and the people you trust who can give you the honest feedback. And in feedback, you don't always agree with everything, but you need you need the kind of feedback to give something to push against, and to and feedback that you trust enough so that you can honestly see things new. And I had great readers, starting with my husband Tom, who's always my first reader, and others who just who gave me a lot of necessary feedback, and asked me to question things. And that's just gold, because you get very wedded and you get myopic to the stuff, and you need to get cold to it in order to go back in and make it better.
I want to just piggyback a question onto that. How early do you bring in readers in your process?
I bring them in pretty late. I'm pretty far down the road with drafts. But sometimes I'll take a scene and have to ask Tom or someone to read it and just see what does this look like? Like what are you reading? What are you hearing? I also really believe in storytelling. I have a really good friend I take walks with, and she often on the walk will talk about her life, and I'll talk about what I'm working on, and as if they're real people. And sometimes sometimes I talk about my life, but I find that really effective. Like, you can tell whether someone's leaning into your story or not, whether they're engaged. It's a very quick way for me to see also where the heat is for me.
It's interesting that involves speech. And I often think about the fact that, storytelling began as an oral tradition, and, attending to the kind of audio power of a story is really important. Do you read aloud your work?
I do.
Is there a kind of component of it that, and when you listen to it?
Yeah, I'll do whatever I can do to get cold to something. I think sometimes we fall in love with, I draft longhand a lot, and just the language of the pen moving on the page or the pencil, you can get into a trance on it. So sometimes to read it aloud, you hear it in a different way. You lose some of those crutches, because you can actually hear where your own voice gets tired or not energized.
Okay, yeah,
Let's
take a look at the Q&A.
What was your creative process for finding Vera's voice? Vera's voice came to me almost from the get-go. Hi, Kim. Thank you for the question. I really liked this gal who was just not a pleaser, but ultimately was so vulnerable. I mean, I found it very freeing to write her. Let's see. Let's see. So loved sinking into Vera. Balm in this tough time. Does Carol have novels from the past that she used as inspiration? Models for such an immersive world? The first writer who came to mind is E.L. Doctorow. I love his work. And I was just thinking today about Ragtime, and the first time I read Ragtime. Jenny, do you remember the first time you read Ragtime? I mean, we were teenagers. I don't know if you read it then.
I only read it in the last 10 years.
Really? Okay. I read it. I'm trying to think when it came out. I think I was 13 or 14, and someone I knew, it was on the bestseller. It was sort of the big book of the time. It may have won the Pulitzer. I don't know, but someone I knew who recommended books to me, an adult, said, this might not be interesting to you, but and handed it to me, and it blew me away. I just loved that sense of a historic world and a fictional world built on top of it. He was just a master at that.
Did you read any fiction of the time? I'm curious about that, because I have found fiction to be such a an amazing tool to deliver up sort of, I don't know, collective knowledge, cultural points of reference, that sort of stuff, even when it's not good. I'm just curious about whether you turn to fiction of your era at all.
No, I read all over the place. I didn't particularly go. I looked at Jack London's stories because he was boots on the ground really immediately after the quake. Mark Twain also, and I wanted to see what they were writing about. But no, I didn't go straight for. I find when I'm deep enough into a novel, I don't know if you're this way. I'm reading a lot of poetry, and I read. I mean, I read so much for narrative and read so much in manuscript, but I'm sort of dabbling into stuff. Like I can't hold all that much at certain points. I'm too deep into the book. So I'm going for inspiration. I'm going for things that feel very alive to me. And I'm often revisiting stuff.
So I think maybe I see one something in the chat and one in the Q&A.
Okay, in the Q&A, there's a good deal of story in the book about the affection and disaffection of sisters, even kinds of betrayal between sisters who nonetheless understand and keep a kind of faith in each other, including sisters who are not blood sisters. That's Vera and Pi. How much of this was on your mind in writing the book, or did it just emerge on its own? That's a great question. I think we can really understand who someone is if we also are given their opposite. And one of the things that came early in the book was this sense of Vera's foster sister Pi being absolutely opposite to who Vera was. Pi is very conventional. She's a beauty. Her goal in life is to marry well or well enough to help out the family situation. But and ultimately these sisters betray one another, but also I hope one feels somewhat sympathetic for Pi because she also is confined to the expectations of being a young lady in 1906, and she doesn't have some of the gifts that Vera has to get to reimagine or reinvent herself.
I mean, actually, I'm going to interject one question and then we'll do the last one. But I wonder in a sibling relationship, which she has with Pi, even though they're not related by blood, whether there's a way in which we define ourselves in opposition to someone else. In other words, whether their opposition partly is created in relation to each other.
Yeah, I think that's certainly, we see that in families all the time, right? That siblings are so different. And are they different because they're told, are they different because just inherently they're different? Are they different because one takes up a certain amount of space so the other fills the space that's left? Are they different because they're told they're different? And they believe that that becomes destiny. I think that's such fertile ground for for fiction. I don't know. I don't think we solved that one tonight.
Let us know when you do.
Yeah, I'll report mother. Let's see. I got to figure out mothers and daughters, and now
Carol, let's go.
Let's go.
Okay, I see one question. I don't know if it's a question in the chat, but there's a something.
Okay, let me see. Thank you so much. Welcome. Can Carol describe? We already did that. I think we may have done it.
All right. Well, I want to give you a chance to say anything that you think we've missed about this totally engrossing romp through earthquake era San Francisco, which I hope everyone is in the process of buying through the Greenlight link right this minute.
You know, one of the things, first of all, thank you, because you are just, as ever, not just a great friend, but so damn smart. There are so many things I haven't thought about that you you brought up, and it's wonderful to chat with you about it. And one of the things, I remember when you read the book early on and you called it a romp, that was one of my favorite things, that sense of an adventure story, that despite disaster and difficulty, it's also like that human spirit to just not just survive but thrive. And thank you for this conversation, and thank everyone who's listening.
I think it's fair to say we all need a romp right now.
We
I
all
defy anyone to tell me that they don't.
Yeah,
So this is your romp.
We all need an adventure. We all need to get out of our boxes, whatever those boxes are, and just go for it. Fly on a magic carpet.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Carol. I'm sorry for my technical difficulties, but I think we navigated them. And thank you, Greenlight, for hosting us.
Thank you, Greenlight.
Thank you both for that fantastic discussion. And thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us. If you missed any of tonight's event, or if you just want to watch it again, we will be posting it to our YouTube channel, so please make sure to look out for it there. And don't forget to buy your copy of Vera in-store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.